Welcome everybody to APCUG's Wednesday workshops, where we are once again going to be meeting and learning about Linux. We have a lot of different information today for all of you who are here interested in learning about Linux. We're happy to have a new person on our panel today and hope that he's able to come back and help out. Cal Esneault is from the Cajun Clickers Computer Club down Baton Rouge. According to the information that we have, he's president along with somebody else who's president, and he does a lot of Linux articles. If you have been reading your push articles that get sent out as another benefit of your APCUG membership, that name should be kind of familiar because he does a lot of Linux articles, and so he's going to be here with us today. Orv's back with us today, and he's going to do a number of things you saw on the list that went out that he'll share, and then I'll finish up the day today, and then we'll have our big Q&A. So again, as a reminder, if you make sure your name is so that we know who you are to match it up. If you have questions for any of the presenters, send those in your chat box, drop the little arrow, select Judy Tallur, C for Cal, O for Orv, J for John, and send them to her, and she will then fire them. At the end of the question and answer that she has, we'll open it up for questions and comments and all that sort of stuff that way. So at this time, this tornado alarm has already gone off, like everybody knows. That's my signal, and we're ready to start. So I'm going to turn things over to Cal, and he's going to be talking to us about the GNOME desktop, or the GNOME desktop, and all the features, because we've never seen a presentation on that, and they just have a brand new one. So Cal, this is up to you, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hopefully my screen is showing.
I can see it.
Okay, I want to introduce myself as an experienced end user, which means I'm not a IT person or a webmaster, but I've used computers for a very long time as a technical user in DEC, DOS, Windows, and Linux. And I've been leading workshops in Linux at the club to help people install it, learn how to use it, and to use it to get things done. And my daily driver is Linux Mint with Cinnamon Desktop, but I also have a dual boot where I occasionally go into GNOME on Ubuntu. And so today I wanted to talk about GNOME since no one had done it. And I'm going to talk from a pretty general perspective. Now, first off, the Linux system, as I see it for the average user, you can kind of break it down to three levels. First, we have the kernel, which is the essential hardware-software interface, and the Linux team takes care of that. Then we have the operating system, which is generally handled in text interface or command line. And the people that handle that are usually what we call the distribution folks. When you go out and get a distribution, these people put the nuts and bolts together. And at a higher level, we have graphic user. People want to use graphic, the mouse and point and click. And so they're developers, and they develop the interface, the actual start menus and all the little menus you use, plus a whole bunch of the applications. And these levels communicate with each other. Many times we call application program interfaces and special commands. And so what it turns out is that the people in one group really don't concern themselves that much with the people in the other group. And this makes, has an influence on how you select and run Linux. Now, when they started graphic interfaces, Linux people decided that if they were going to do the interface, they also had to add a lot of helpful utilities. And combining these two, they call these desktop environments. So it's not just the desktop you see, but it's also the supporting players. And the best way to explain this is to say there's GNOME, KDE, XFCE, LXQT, to get it, those are examples of desktop interfaces that we run into all the time. So my question is, how do you build your Linux? And so do you consider the distribution group first, pick them because of their reliability, their stability, how current is their software, and then they all generally offer a variety of desktops that you can select from. So is the distribution people the ones you worry about, or because of muscle memory, we all get used to using a certain type of desktop. And so if you look at it from that perspective, then you can go find, well, what distribution has that? So which way you start from is a point of view. Today, I'm going to start from the GNOME desktop viewpoint, and I'm going to cover several distributions, and I'll point them out as we go through. So let's start with the desktop history. We got to talk about in the 1970s, AT&T developed a software operating system called Unix, but they were not allowed to get into computers because they had a monopoly in phone systems. So what they did was they allowed universities and colleges to use it. But then in around 1984, they broke up and they got the right to computers back, and they went and told the universities, hey, we want this back. And that was a big revolt because the universities need to publish open, publish or perish, they need to teach. And so they started, among people in the universities, started something called a GNU project, which looked like Unix, acted like Unix, responded like Unix, but was not Unix. So GNU means GNU is not Unix. And it took a while for them to rewrite all the necessary parts of an operating system, but they were mainly working on larger computers at universities. In 1991, Linus Torvalds, a graduate student in Finland, wrote the kernel that would work on x86 computers. Those are the Windows PC types. And then in 1992, he joined with the GNU people and made it all open and free. So that was the start of Linux. And it was very well received by those people who had spent years learning Unix. But after a few years, they decided, well, why don't we make a graphic user interface just like Windows and Mac? And so they started working on that. And the result was Gnome I. And the main contributors at the time were GIMP, which they wrote graphics tools. They had the GIMP program is like a Photoshop. The GNU people who had all of the utilities, and Red Hat, which was a commercial entity distributing Linux. They formed what was called the GNOME project. So you have to have a foundation that is a nonprofit group to coordinate all the various people involved, because this is people were donating all of the software, and they had a community focus, which meant that individuals could submit software. And to point out at the time, desktops like GNOME and XFCE used the graphic control tools known as GTK, which is the GIMP toolkit. Whereas KDE used Qt tools, or they call it Qt. So which tools you use generally separates people out into groups, because if you're going to submit another program for them to use, it really helps. It's not necessary, but it really helps if they use the same graphic toolkits. And another kind of view on GNOME is that they like the component approach and many small apps, because then individuals could volunteer and add small apps, whereas KDE liked the bigger complex apps, which generally meant that you had to have a larger team and you had to work in that team. So it was very successful. In 2003, they came out with their Gnome II, which used an improved GTK2 toolkit. And everybody was happy and things went along. And so I'd like to give an example of Gnome II. And here is version 2.22. And it was included in Ubuntu 8.04, which was released in 2008. Now, Ubuntu came along and used GNOME, and it really made an impact on Linux, because it started out, a billionaire gave about $10 million to start this company, and they solved a lot of problems so that when you started it up, it would auto-detect your hardware and auto-install. And it selected only user-friendly apps. So it was a good way to get out into the public. And I started using that probably around 2006. And I used it for 6 or 7 years exclusively. And I'll point out some of the basic design features. First off, Mac had a top panel and Windows had a bottom panel. So they just had both. And at the top, you'll see the various command structures in time. And at the bottom, would show whichever window applications you had open. And they also had workspaces. And workspaces, the way I describe them, they are present now in Windows and Mac. Instead of having, if you have 2 or 3 applications open and you have like one on top of another, then you have to click to get that application up to the front. Whereas in a workspace, you kind of put them horizontally and you just slide back and forth between the workspaces. It's a technique that I got used to, and it's hard for me not to use it. So one thing you noticed about the Linux at the time, it was very well organized. You had the applications, places for like all your files, systems were all your settings. And then when you went to your applications, they were all grouped according to like graphics and internet and office. So it was all grouped, and it had the slide out, fly out menus. And one of the things you notice is it was a lot of text. And they had some graphics, but for people who had used computers for a while, it was easy to use the text. So this was very, very popular, used by a lot of the Gnome II was used by a lot of distributions. Then Gnome III came along, 2011. The Gnome people developed also the toolkit. So they developed Gnome III toolkit and launched the shell using the new toolkit. Now, they're kind of, the Gnome people are kind of experts, and they kind of do a lot of stuff. So they have an idea of what a computer should do. And their way was it had to get out of the way. They were tired of seeing all of these icons and toolbars, and they wanted to simplify it. So what they did, and I'll give an example with Magia 8, is they had a desktop which had one single bar and had very little on it. And that's where your application would run. So how do you get to your controls? What they did was they had an activities button at the top. And when you hit this activities button, you went from what I would call the workspace or application space into a control space. So when you hit it, all of a sudden you got all the controls you were looking for. On the left side, you had a dock, a vertical dock. This is, you'd call it your favorites bar. You click on it and would start a program. And on the right, you'd have all your workspaces, and they would show up on the right and show what you had in it. I want you to notice that at that time, that was when computers went from being a 4x3 because there were CRT tubes to 16x9 because they were now all flat panel LCDs. And so they said, well, let's make more use of the width of the screen. And they also had a launcher. It's like your Windows Start button. And it would launch the dash. And this was the dash. So instead of now having this very well controlled fly out text menu, they had a graph of icons. It still had a little text at the bottom, but the icons were big. And it's just like your phone, and you could have different pages. In fact, this shows the influence of those phones and tablets. So the people at the time said, well, let's do this. It'll be real fancy, and it'll be like phones. And people at that time thought, well, the tablets may take over. Then when you click on one of you to go back, if you just clicked on the activities button, and let's say I had all my programs in a window, I could click on the one I wanted, and I could change the desktop. Then one advantage is what you could do is then drag one program into an empty workspace. And so you could kind of arrange and organize all your programs. You could have as many workspaces as you needed. And you could have each one in a different workspace, and you could move them back and forth. So it was an organization tool. And the concept was that it was a very streamlined overview of a complex workflow where you have many programs open. Remember, the people that wrote this work at computers all day long, and they were very competent. And so they used lots of programs. So this was what they thought was the perfect interface. And when you clicked back onto a workspace itself, you could control the apps that were in that window. They also had settings where they had essential system changes, but not much. The GNOME people really thought, well, you should be smart enough to go out and get any changes you want. They had a limited view of what should be configured for you. It turns out the other group of people, the distribution people who were using these, they just almost had a heart attack, and they received a whole lot of pushback. This changed the workflow. It changed all of the methods they were using. And this had just been kind of forced on them. One of the things it resulted in was a lot of alternative desktops came out. Two I'm familiar with, and one I use a lot is Cinnamon, and another one is Mate. There were two desktops that were basically, everything was just like GNOME, except that interface, that front part. But despite the pushback, Gnome III did survive in popularity. It's still around. And there's some reasons for it. First off, Gnome is the leader of community involvement, depth of support of money and contributions, and free software. It's kind of one of those free software foundations that keeps the whole thing going against commercial enterprises. And I guess some people liked it. It was good if you had a lot of things going on. So not all change is bad. And the real reason, I think, was that the Gnome was not just a desktop. Gnome was all these little utilities. And here I've just listed a partial list. And you can see that they had a text editor, and they had something to make burn CDs and DVDs, and on and on. And so if you got away from Gnome, what were you going to do? You are used to using these. So one of the solutions was to just modify the desktop separate from all of the utilities. And that's where the Cinnamon and Mate and others of that like took off. And through the years, the volunteers would write various patches. For instance, extensions, I'll show at the end. Various little add-ons that you could use to configure any way you wanted. But it didn't come from Gnome. It came from the individuals. So here's an example of Gnome 3 with Ubuntu. This is something I use. And Ubuntu had a lot of experience with users, and they wanted to be friendly to new users, but still allow the power users to have their say. And for a while, when Gnome came out with Gnome 3, they had their own version called Unity, which they eventually, a few years ago, abandoned and went back to Gnome. But Unity was really a lot more like Gnome 3 than anything else. It was just Ubuntu's desktop because they were trying to make it an Ubuntu phone and a few other things. So what they did is they pre-configured it with more options that were directly available right from the top without having to go out looking for things. And for instance, the dock, which didn't show up in Gnome 3, was always shown in Ubuntu, and you could easily switch it to the bottom if you wanted, or the right side. So it was just a simple click in the settings, and if you used Windows, this made you feel a little happier. If you wanted the vertical, and I liked it because then I'd put the key programs I was always using there, and it was a quicker way to get to them. And in the settings, they had appearance, which you won't find this appearance in stock Gnome. You have to kind of add it on. And so, for instance, you could easily go to settings and you could change a light or dark style, or change the size of the icons. For instance, here is a light style and here is a dark style. Of course, dark style has become popular among people who do a lot of computing to reduce the strain on their eyes if they're looking at computer screens all day long. And so it minimized the need for people to go to configuration apps. It was easier for new users. And as they got more experience, they could modify it just like any Gnome. Well, then what's the latest thing that just came out and kind of caused me to want to talk about this subject? In February, they came out with a GTK4 toolkit. And that means that GTK3 is still the support, but if anybody is still using GTK2, they won't be supported anymore. But I think most people have over the years drifted from 2 to 3. And almost simultaneously, they released the Gnome 40 desktop. Now, this was kind of strange because they used to name everything. You would expect that they would go to like 4.1, 4.2. But what they're really going to do is go to 40, 41, 42. And I think that's because they got burned with going from 2 to 3. So that maybe they just hide it. And they say, well, we're going to 40. It's a whole different thing. But they did switch to the GTK4 tools. And this is going to take a while for it to filter through all the sub-applications and the distributions. And Ubuntu, their latest edition, interim edition of 2104, they didn't have time to use it. I'm sure in 2110 they will adapt to it. But I did find Fedora 34 used it. And so I got a live distro on that, and I'll show you what it looks like. So here it is, Gnome 40 on Fedora 34. And what I found is that most of the things didn't change. So what has changed for the toolkit is for the developers who write the programs, but what we see is not a whole lot of difference. However, they did work with their interface, their starting panel. So they have, first off, we have the familiar, when you start it up, one panel, activities here, virtually nothing else. I'm going to just shut the system down. But then when the big change is the overview. So here I have the overview, and what they've done is they've made it horizontal versus vertical. So they said, well, it made sense that we had more screen real estate. But in truth, the way human beings work is we kind of, if you have a desk, you kind of go from the left side and the right side. You don't lean over your desk. And it's just a more natural human way is to slide left and right. So if you go to activities and punch up the grid, the program grid, what you'll see is the favorites dock stays at the bottom and is vertical. And it's a little bit wider so that it's not a square presentation as it was. And then the thumbnails used to not be available, but now you can see them and they're a lot bigger and they're right above all the applications. And what I find is, I like to look, but one of the advantages is if you want to start a program, what you used to have to do is go and open that workspace and then go find the program and open it. Here you can directly open the program and just drag it into the workspace and you can see where your other programs are. So that's pretty good. Now, if you just hit activities and you have something going on, this view, the thumbnails are now smaller view, but the horizontal orientation, but the content shows for all of your screens. So this is kind of, you can help navigate, or you can move this, and what you can do. So here are two screens that I can see them both at the same time. And if I scroll, and here I've scrolled to the right, so you can see this is desktop 2, desktop 3, and desktop 4. There's 2, 3, and 4 here. So it shows up, and it's a very natural, you scroll with your mouse wheel is one way to do it. And it's very fluid, and so that you can quickly review what's going on. And it has these little icons so that you can quickly see what kind of program is that. You don't have to try to impossibly low, small text. You can see that that's something to do with maintenance. And this is a terminal. You can quickly identify. They also made it laptop friendly. And now they allow gestures. And with the gestures, for instance, you can scroll it. Or you can use the super key and scroll it even if you're in the desktop view. So one thing I should say, if you use Gnome, Gnome has the super key shortcuts. And I don't like shortcuts a lot, but there's a few key ones that I like. The super key is usually the Windows, the key on your keyboard, which is the Windows icon. And if you press that, and if you press that, it will automatically be the same as pressing activities. So you don't have to go up with your mouse way to the top. If you do it super A, it'll show you that grid of programs. It's really quick. And if you do super page up and page down, it moves between workspaces without you having to go to activities and point to it. So it's, once you get used to it, it's very, very good. The rest of them, well, they're good, but I'm not I generally am more mouse driven than super keys. But these are some super keys that I find are essentially helpful. So the question is, and I know other presentations, they've customized their desktop. What about customizing Gnome? Well, it is customizable, very customizable, but you have to know what you're doing. So that's kind of an issue. There are many extensions, themes, etc., that have been written by volunteers. But some of them may require you to go to root access and dig around in your system. And so the trend has been for various distributions, even though you use Gnome, to pre-customize, like I showed you with Ubuntu, and give you tools so that the average user doesn't have to go into these into the file systems and know as much. So having said that, what you think about Gnome may vary on which distribution you pick. So that's kind of a warning. Somebody, you go to one distribution, Gnome looks okay. You go to another one, you don't like it, because they are doing this to simplify it. One thing in Gnome, you go to settings and you find out, just like I showed you, there's not much there. Ubuntu added a few things. If you go to Magia or something, there's very few. So, and they don't even have an appearance option. So what you have to do is you have to go to the repository and get a Tweaks tool. It's often included as the default. And there you find the appearance and workspace options. So here is Ubuntu with Gnome Tweaks. So this is the Gnome Tweaks app. And you can see here you can do workspaces and various things you want to modify. Over here, I'll put it on themes. And the themes, you can have them for the applications, the cursor, or the icons. And if I go in and click down on any one of these, I'll have choices. So here I've clicked down on the appearance, and there all I have to do is click one, and if I wanted a dark theme or a high contrast theme, it'll show it. Now, it is customizable, but I've added a couple themes, and I'll tell you how to do it. It's not for everyone. So what you have to do is you go to a website called Gnome Look, and then you find the one you want, you download it, extracted it from the compressed folder, then you move it over. You have to sometimes make this directory in your home folder, and then you have to use user themes extension for this to run in that place, and then it works. Not too bad, but it's not for the brand new user. However, once you know how to do it, there's over 1,400 themes available. And so I'll show you 3 of them here. Here is the theme that should be, it's the same item shown in 3 different themes, the default theme, the dark theme, and then one I just picked at random. You can see it's got a little dark and a little light. And it's also got different colored buttons instead of the minimize, maximize, exit. And there are just hundreds of these themes that you can do. What has today, people have mostly recommend, I guess you go to extensions. An extension are scripts that are made to run again in your local directory, so it's not to mess up your system. And it simplifies everything, and it also gives you the ability to add a lot of different little widgets and command things, control features. And the way you install it, generally the easiest way is you go to your browser and you go to extensions.gnome.org, gnome.org, and follow the instructions so that it'll link your computer to your browser. And then you go in and you find the extension you want and add it. And I would also say that after you've added these extensions, you can add another app that's in your repository called extensions. And this allows you to turn them off and on and remove them directly from the desktop. You can also do it from your browser. And all I would say is that the extensions vary greatly. They're not really organized well enough. You have to kind of hunt and peck and try them out. And the maintenance varies. By that I mean is sometimes they just go away. They're written by individuals, and if they don't maintain them, then they'll go away. Overall, GNOME kind of makes sure that they're kind of okay and they meet minimum criteria. So here's some examples of some extensions I added. Here I've added the classic drop-down menu and places. And here I've added a bottom bar where you can see what items are open, what apps are open, and the workspaces in the bar. So what this means is you can make Gnome 40 look like Gnome 2 or Gnome 3, anything you want, depending on your patient. I'm going to give you an overview is that Gnome is a well-established, popular desktop environment. And the Gnome project is a nonprofit and a long-time leader in promoting free and open source software. And it has a lot of support from a lot of people with money and a lot of people with time. It also develops a toolkit. So that's why when GTK 4 comes out, Gnome 40 comes out. And it emphasizes stability and component building for many small programs. And due to the fact that it's open source and component, it is the starting point for a lot of distributions and spin-off desktops. And these distributions often pre-configure GNOME. And the most recent version was released just recently with more polish. I really like it. I think it's a much smoother operation getting between the workspaces. And in general, it is a very stable, secure platform for experienced users and mission-critical system. So if you have something in production, you don't want it to change from under your feet. And you can do anything you want, and it's very stable, doesn't change much. The new users can learn it. It's less complex. It doesn't have the bells and whistles. Therefore, the configuration is less user-friendly. And it doesn't have the latest software. In order to, it takes a while for software to migrate into it. So where would you find GNOME? Here are some distributions. that you can find it. Some are based on Arch, some are Ubuntu derivatives, SUSE, all over. So depending on what distribution you trust or like the most, you can add Gnome to it. So there you go. Don.
That was great. Whoops. That was great. Had to make sure my thing was down. You've even made me somebody who might start to like Gnome more. I was back in the days, I was the 2.2 user for a long time, and then when they switched, that's when I kind of left. But after looking at the 4.0, I think it does have a lot of good features for and it all depends on what kind of a workflow each user has.
Right.
That's what's so nice about Linux with all the different desktops that can do different options for how simple you want. So great. We'll check on questions for a little bit later. At this time, if you do have questions, remember, put them in the chat box for Judy, put a C in there for Cal, and ask any kind of questions you want about Gnome and the old Gnome and the new Gnome. There's no Gnome like a good new Gnome. Judy has her hand up, reminding people what?
No, I'm just, I'm not a Linux person, but I so appreciate the history and everything that he took us through, because the light more or less dawned for me in listening to the presentation, and it was just so cool that I think I kind of get it now. So thank you so much for that.
I couldn't agree more with you, Judy. And Judy, after she watched the Cinnamon desktop, said, that's the one I kind of like because of the way it flows. And I'm sure we can have a lot of good discussions about people's favorite desktops and what they do to customize it. I was really surprised when I saw Cal's change for his Gnome 40 to make it look more like Gnome II. But that's the beauty with open source. You can do just about anything. Orv, we're ready for you. You've got some really good topics for today. So I will turn the thing over to you and go.
Sounds good. How's my audio?
I can hear it good.
Okay. Let's see here. I think this is the desktop I want. How's that?
Good.
Good. We're getting to the point where I started to get, well, not into the weeds, but more detailed stuff about Linux. And as I worked on this, I kept coming across stuff. I thought that would really be useful. So this is the stuff we're going to cover. Graphical remote access to a device. An overview of the X windowing system, which was the first graphical user interface, predated Microsoft Windows, who hijacked the name by about 30 years. VNC and some others are tools you use for remote graphical access. I talk about the capital X switch when you SSH into something, how that works into graphical remote access. Talk about the screen command. It's a little unrelated, but it lets you do remote stuff. And I'm going to talk about system monitoring tools. Don't think we've covered that in real detail. So anyway, X Windows or X11 or just X is a windowing system. What that means is it's just smart enough to manage the size and location of a window on your screen. And it doesn't mandate any specific user interface. That is to say, GNOME, KDE Plasma, LXDE, they all use the underlying X windows, or just X, to put windows on the screen. those user interfaces have to specify the shape, the location, if one window overlaps another, is it in front or is it back, the window decorations, all of those detailed stuff are the responsibility of the user interface. So there's an X Windows client and an X Windows server. The client is used by an application to put its display onto the screen. The X server is the one that actually does it. In other words, the X client tells the X server, this is the size of the window, this is the content, I want it placed here. So running a program is separate from its UI display. That's a kind of a concept we've not introduced to this point. And because of that, that actual display, the thing you see, can be shown pretty much anywhere. It doesn't have to be on the computer where the display, where the program is running. X11 is been around for, geez, 50 years, and it has a lot of cruft in it. A lot of stuff was thrown in early on. Protocols that aren't used anymore, features that have never been used, stuff like that. And it has to run as root, which is kind of fraught with hazards if somebody finds a vulnerability. They've cleaned it up a lot over the last 5 years or so, but about that same time, they started developing the Wayland windowing system. Much cleaner, much current. It does not support remote access. It's not intended for managing a GUI that's actually where the program is running on a remote machine. We're still in transition. Most distributions support both now. I don't expect any of the distributions to drop X Windows anytime soon. I'm running Kubuntu, and I suspect all of the other applications at login will let you pick either one. On Kubuntu, Wayland is getting better. The KDE Plasma support of Wayland lagged a little behind the others. I find it still just a little bit glitchy. Every month or two, I try it again, and it's slowly getting better, and I'll probably switch over to it in a few months. So I tried to draw a dashed line around the top of this to indicate that the keyboard, mouse, screen, and everything in the purple X server window are all on one device. That could be a server, it could be a client, doesn't matter. But what it's showing is the program that they're using is running on the remote machine, and the X client is managing it. It throws the UI back to the machine running the X server and tells it where to put on the screen. So it looks like you're running it locally, but you're really running it remotely. And I'll do some demonstrations on all of this. So there's remote GUI access programs that take advantage of this. They are like RDP, which is now the remote desktop connection. That's a proprietary Windows to Windows protocol. But then you have VNC, Virtual Network Computing, which will talk anything to anything. Some examples are Tight VNC, Real VNC, and Tiger VNC. Almost all of these have both a client app and a server app, as you'd expect. GNOME RDP will do either RDP, VNC, or it will do it via SSH. And KDE Plasma has the KDE Remote Desktop Client, which will do VNC or RDP, and that's what I use. And our desktop, which is a very simple program, is RDP only. If you're running a Linux box and you wanted to remote into a Windows box, this would be fine. So SSH with the -X switch. What it does is when you SSH into a remote device with the X switch, it primes that box to say, if they run a GUI application, throw the application back on the machine where they logged in from, and I'll demonstrate that. And here's the sample, SSH-X user ID at the remote box, or if you've set up SSH keys like we've talked about, you just SSH-X remote Linux box, and then you start your command, start your program. It can't be done as root because there's too many security vulnerabilities if you do that. I'll follow up with a demo. The screen command is kind of cool. You can log in remotely, start a running command, and detach it and leave it running and come back later. That's very handy if you have a long-running process on a remote machine or a local machine and you don't want to tie up a window. And I'll demonstrate that. You type screen to start the session. And by the way, it's not installed by default on most apps. So you just apt-y install screen, or go to your GUI installer and find screen. And while it's running your program, you type Control-A-D to detach. And when you're ready to reattach, it's screen-R. It's a little more complicated if you have multiple screen sessions running, but the docs explain how to do that. I won't demo that today. And within the screen program, you just exit to go to the non-screen command line. And there's tons of other functions available. Many years ago, I was having trouble with a machine, and my local guru logged in remotely with a screen command that let me see what he was doing. It was a screen sharing command. That was pretty cool. There is an alternate to it called TMUX. A lot of people prefer it to screen. Take a look at it if you want. I thought it was a little clunky myself since I was already used to screen. You know how it is. You prefer what you've learned initially. You can just go, search for Google Linux screen examples, something like that. And there's the one I pulled most of my stuff off of. So you can monitor with the GUI or the non-GUI, and there are tools for both, and I'll show them both. XOS View is the grand old daddy of GUI monitoring, and I still run it from time to time. It really shows you what's going on. KDE, as you'd expect, has a system monitor. GNOME has a system monitor. GChrome is a kind of an interesting app. It can be done. You can monitor a local machine or a remote machine if you install GChrome D, D for daemon, as a remote server. G means GNU, and I thought I read someplace that Chrome was meant Windows in some foreign language, but I couldn't find it. And there is GChrome for Windows. Since a lot of open source programs grow up in Linux, they all eventually end up ported to Windows. So system monitoring at the command line, you probably know about top, the top processes. We can show that. HTOP is a more sophisticated version of that. And there's another one called PTOP. I want to talk a little bit about this. PTOP is written in Python, and there are a plethora of Python libraries, tools, utilities, and you couldn't possibly expect the distro repositories to keep track of all that stuff. So the popular languages have their own distro and their own installer. The installer for Python is pip. So you have to do an app install pip and then pip install ptop. Perl has its own repository called cpan, and it's hugely complicated. But anyway, if you want to run ptop, you install pip first and then do a pip install. Whipped through that quickly, didn't I? Let me clear some stuff off here. Let me close this down here. I'll close that. Let me close that. Let me expand this. I want to make this so we can see it better. Appearance, choose, and we'll go to 14. That didn't work. And we'll go to 16. There we go, that's better. Okay, we'll talk. I'm going to go kind of out of order as I think about them. If I miss any, let me know. So anyway, that's the top command. It will show everything, every process that's run, every process that the OS is managing, including the hundreds that are idle, not doing anything. If you do a top space I, it'll just show you the running commands, and you can see them here. And there's a lot of information up at the top. It's 10 o'clock, single user logged in, the load averages, that's the 1 minute, and let me think, 1 minute, 5 minute, 10 minute, I don't know, I forget. Just a quick comment about load. Load is not CPU utilization. Load is the average number of processes waiting to be started by the CPU. And the rule of thumb is, in Linux, a load of 1 per CPU is, if your load runs above 1 for extended amounts of time, you probably need more CPU. Notice my load is 4. Well, this is a 4-core box, so I'm in pretty good shape. Memory used, swapped used, or swap free, I should say. And then you can see all of the applications that are running there. Zoom is using almost one CPU. That's okay. There are keyboard commands to sort on different columns and stuff like that. And if you hit the I key, it takes it out of busy and shows you everything. And you can see all of those down at the bottom that are there but not doing anything. And it's Q to quit. I think I talked about HTOP. Yeah, this one's a little cuter. Basically the same thing, but a little more graphic view of what's going on. And see the load is dropping a little bit. 151 tasks. And again, Q to quit. See, I don't have ptop installed here, so I'll install it. And I'm going to do a graphical install. Let's see if pip is installed. The installer. No. Install pip. Now we'll do a pip install. I don't know if you have to be root for this or not. Now let's see if we can run pip ptop. There we go. It's a little cooler. Have to wait for it to scroll left to right. There we go. So that's, I guess you'd call that semi-graphical. Now, all these tools are useful. It gives you all of the keyboard commands down at the bottom. Control K to kill, Control Q to quit. It's nice to have them on the screen. So we'll quit that. Oh, let me show the, oh, wrong one. Here's my, Cal had mentioned with the wider screens, it's handy to put your stuff on the left. So I've got my taskbar all the way over on the left. By the way, I mentioned gcrelm. These are some gcrelm daemons running, and you can change the background and stuff. What do they call it? They call it a theme. Yeah. And I've got 4 different themes, so they're visually different. This one up here on the left is the machine I'm using here. And they're chugging along. The other 3 are remote devices. gcrelm is running on this computer here, but it's polling gchrome-d, which is running on the remote device. So you only have to send the numbers across instead of all the GUI information, which is many times larger. And you can see that my home server is running 0% utilization. It's just a web server. Down at the bottom, this one here, the Web Shack PC, you can see it's 64% utilization. That's because it's running a Windows 10 VM that's running some fairly busy ham radio apps. And this one here that says me, that's sitting at 28% utilization steady, that's my video security system server. That's a Raspberry Pi 4 managing 4 cameras, and keeps it pretty busy. Oh, I was going to find the other graphical ones. Good luck on finding them. Let's say system. We'll say monitor, M-O-N-I-T-O-R. Okay, here's the GNOME system monitor. Pretty much what you'd expect. And here's the KDE system monitor. And you can see I kind of like, I'm sure they're all configurable, but just comparing the two, I like the GNOME one here because it shows you some history, not just an instantaneous snapshot. So let me show you SSH -X. Now, how do you know if it's installed? By the way, if you're going to do this to a Raspberry Pi, if you've installed the Lite Raspbian, or it's actually RaspbiOS distro now, it does not include any GUI stuff. You have to install the full, or just Google how to install X Windows on Raspbian Lite, and that will be all you need. By the way, I use the which command. If you say which, the OS will go out and search your search path, which is the list of directories where executables might be, and it will see if you can find, see if the program you want to run exists in your search path. And I'm going to search for xclock. And there it is. It's not installed by default. It's in a package like X Windows Utilities or Xutils or something like that. If you search for xclock, it'll probably tell you where it is. Anyway, it's a handy tool to try. Let me do a -help here. -update1. So xclock is running on the remote server, but its display is showing here. Now xclock's no big deal, but if I've had to run Firefox remotely on a remote device, and that's worked fine as long as you have enough bandwidth. So I can X out here to exit it, or I can just Control-C here. See if I installed XOSView here. Nope. I was going to demo XOSView remotely, but I have to install it. By the way, remember I said it wouldn't let you, it doesn't, SSHing, if I SSH'd in with -X as root, it might let me run it, I'm not sure. Letting users SSH into a box as root is considered very poor security. Most Linux boxes are set up to not allow root to be logged in. If yours is, I would Google how to disallow it, log in as your regular user and switch to root. So anyway, I'm going to demo XOS view, which I think is cool. Now you got this little box that's kind of useless, but then if you go like this box has 4 CPUs, 0, 1, 2, 3, and you can see how they're working. Just a couple things about this. Oh, I see. Used to be, down at the bottom is the network traffic. Used to be, it was not included in the view unless you put in a -n network switch or something, but I see this version has added it by default, which is useful. You can see disk writes occasionally. Notice how the operating system moves tasks around between the CPUs. That's any multiple CPU, multiple core system. Any OS should be able to manage the load and spread it among the CPUs, except under certain special conditions. In fact, a program that's well written, as it spins threads off to do, subroutines, should be smart enough to tell the server spin it off to a free core. Just a quick comment about memory. Green is used, red is buffers, slab is some sort of operating system thing, cache and free. You'll notice that there's quite a bit cached and much less free. That's a misnomer. In a Linux system, free memory should be called virgin. That's memory that's not been used since the last boot. It's fresh, untouched. All of the stuff in cache, a large majority of it is stuff that was used in the past, and because he's got free memory, he leaves it in the cache. That means if you need to launch it again, it will launch it out of memory, not out of disk, and that considerably speeds up your process, your launching process. What else was I going to talk about? Oh, the screen command. Let's see if screen's installed here. Nope, let's install it. I'm old school. I install on the command line just because my fingers are on the keyboard already. I'm going to type screen, and that's the introduction program. So I'm in screen. I'll run top like this. Now you'd quit out of top, but if I do, let's see if this works, Control AD, you can see I'm detached from it. You could say screen is running top here, but if I want to reattach to it, there we go. I see a couple things that are wrong there. It's always good to check your systems. I can quit out of it. Now I'm still in a screen command. To exit out, screen is terminating. I get back to my home computer here. John, I'll just take questions. I may have missed something, or maybe I raised some questions.
Well, we can always check and see. One other thing I'll throw out at you for probably later is maybe you've talked a lot about your Raspberry Pis, and it might be good if we can be able to have a little demo sometime where you can actually show what a Pi looks like and what all you can connect to it, and things like that.
Sure.
Yeah, I think give it a check.
Raspberry Pi show and tell.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes.
To show it on screen, it's not going to be anything because the Raspberry Pi has a graphical user interface and it has the command line. So, it won't look any different than what we see right now, but physically to show the size, I've got one and it's amazing how small and what it's changed to. And
You want me to go get
hooking
one
up.
now? I mean, I can do that. I mean, you know,
Well,
or we can schedule it.
Yeah, well, you can have it there in the background if we have some extra time.
No, I mean, I could run out to my workshop and grab one.
Yeah, yep. I figured
Now,
you could.
now or later.
Well, let's see if there's anything else. You can go get it and while I'm presenting and stuff.
Okay.
Orv, thank you much for that. Years ago, one of our members gave us a presentation on that, and we were just mesmerized as he sat in front of the group at a table and just kept adding all this stuff, and we're looking up the screen going, you got to be kidding. So that's why I would like you to do it, because you guys are always talking about it. And if people haven't seen what you can do with something teeny tiny, it's way cool. So run out to the workshop when John's giving his presentation.
I'll do that.
You guys, your presentations are so clear, or everybody that's here is learning so much that they're getting it and everything. But would you recommend, what would you recommend as a VNC-like arrangement for a headless Raspberry Pi from a Chromebook and Windows? He's using VNC for now. He'd like to know if there is a Chrome extension.
I don't know.
I figured that'd be your answer because you're not a Chrome person. But when I send this out to the everybody after in the follow-up material, I bet there'll be an answer there. Why do you use SU and not SUDO when running admin commands?
Because I'm old school. SU space dash. SU means switch user. Sudo means do SU, you know, SUDO. The dash means you can SU to any user, doesn't have to be root, but if it was an ordinary user, you'd have to have their password, unless you were root, which I should demo that next time. But you can use sudo, and most of the modern distros will give the first created user sudo privileges, but not the second person or third person. I will switch to root. Oh, by the way, you can switch to root with sudo su, and then you'll be root until you exit back out. Sudo has gotten a lot smarter. It used to be if you had to write a type of series of commands that required sudo privileges, which are root privileges, you'd have to preface each and every one with sudo, and that was really annoying. But sometime in the past, while I wasn't looking, if you sudo a command and then you sudo another command, it won't prompt you for the password again the second time or third. It remembers that you have sudo privs for a while, and I don't know how that mechanism works. But old school, I just SU to root, do all my root work, and exit back. They're both fine. If you have a multi-user system, and most people don't, and you want a second or third user to have sudo privileges, you have to go in and modify the sudoers file, and there's a special vi sudo program to edit it. And there's a lot of documentation on how to do it. Very few of the audience will need to do that, but it's just good to know it's out there.
Okay, now I have a Raspberry Pi question. Setting up a Raspberry Pi as a photo server to use in place of Google Photos and other online photo sharing utilities. Is it possible to do that?
Yes.
I just thought I'd throw that out there for you.
Well, at home, you mean? Sure.
Yeah.
Well, then it becomes a file server because photos are just files, right?
I guess hopefully that'll answer Mike Ungerman's question.
Well, it's a partial answer. There are a lot of applications that let you manage photos on a file server, and you'd have to find one that you like to run on whatever your file server is. Or, okay, we're getting in the weeds here. Some file manager on your main machine that lets you access the photos on your photo server remotely instead of having to sit in front of a photo server. It's this whole local and remote thing. That's what I do. All of my video, all of my 235,000 photos are on my file server out in the garage. But I never, it's just a little thing like a small toaster on a shelf someplace. I don't look at it but once a year maybe.
Thank you. And those are your photos from your towers, right?
No, that I started using a digital camera in 2000.
Oh.
Well, got 4 grandkids, 7 grandkids, parents, in-laws, cousins, relatives, family reunions, marriages, weddings, divorces, birthdays. Well, maybe not divorces, but lots and lots of photos.
And lots of photos of cats.
Yeah, I have a cat subdirectory.
I figured so. Anyway, we're going to go over to John and you can scoot out to the workplace.
I'll go get a box of junk.
Good, thank you.
Bring me back a peach pie too. All right. Let me switch to a different computer.
Well, you're leaving the dreaded Windows computer now.
You bet. Right now, though, it's confusing because, oh.
We have a commercial. We've never had a commercial before.
I know it. I thought I was going to have to plug in my, yes, I do, because I want to control that computer. So need to move a mouse. Good. So now I'm controlling my Linux computer. All right. So we're going to go on and I'm going to use get this worked out here. Now I'm back to my other computer. Okay, there we go. So I can minimize this out and minimize that. Somebody made a mention about, clean desktop. This desktop uses the Mate desktop, but I've modified it enough so I have a very clean desktop, and I have panels that'll pop out from the sides if I need them, but I'm going more towards the key commands to run things, so I really don't need much of anything on there. All right, so let's go to the other desktop. We've had a lot of questions and some discussions in the past about partitioning because we talked about the need for setting up hard drives to use Linux or whatever. So I thought today we would take a look at the idea of partitioning, looking at one program that handles the partitioning, and then afterwards go into using the partition command or program to partition a hard drive for the needs you have for installing a Linux. I can't click that one, so I do this one. There are 2 main programs that are available for partitioning, and they come from the command line. And a lot of people, when they get used to using the command line, find that they can do things faster that way. The thing with the command line, it's going to be all text driven. Ask questions, choose an answer. Next question, next step, ask another question, choose answers. But I'm going to demo since the majority of people right now are GUI people, we'll do that. So fdisk and parted are the 2 programs that are mostly used from the command line to do partitioning and some other things, because a lot of times programs will do more than one. Okay. If we switch to graphical user interfaces, I had to do the UI because it won't fit up there, but that's reminder, because Judy always says sometimes they don't know what the letters are. And we have graphical programs. One's called GParted. That's the one I'm going to be demonstrating today. And that is the graphical parted program. So they took the parted program, add the graphic front end for it, and you got GParted. KDE has their own partitioning managing program. That's the one that Orv would use, and he might be able to add some other things about it later in our discussion. Gnome has its program. It's called Gnome Disks, and sometimes they're going shorter and just called disks. The newest one that's coming out, it's still in development yet, is coming from the people who are using the Qt. Cal mentioned about that type of software development. So those people are taking the parted program and are trying to put a Qt front end on it. And that should be out more stable right now. But I'm going to stick with the GParted and show you the other, what KDE looks like. Now, there are other programs out there available that are, technically not open source Linux type ones. These names are ones that you probably have seen and maybe used. I've used the Aomi Partition Assistant in my Windows days, and the ASUS one, or the EasyUS, and Active and Paragon are other partition programs. But the surprising thing is that you might discover that most of these programs are actually based off of the Linux partitioning program. We were doing it one time with our computers in our classroom and had been using, I don't remember if it was, it might have been the ASUS, EasyUS. And the Windows guy came after me and said, why is there a Linux folder on this computer? And so I had to say to him, well, that's basically because you're using a Linux program, because Linux is what can run off of live CDs. Windows can't. You can't do a live CD without a license. This is just a quick view of what the GParted program looks like. And I'm only doing it so that you can just see, when I should go to the next slide, how the KDE people said, oh, we're going to make it a little bit different. And so there's the KDE partition management. Both do pretty much the same thing, but somebody said, oh, I'm going to design it and do it this way. And we'll talk about some of the differences, and you'll see that. I'm going to go through a number of things from the slides, and then we're going to go to the actual program. But I needed to do this, so if anybody happens to just download the slideshow, they get most of the stuff. The main components of the partitioning program, specifically GParted that I'm doing, is it has a menu across the top, a drop-down list of devices that are connected. There is a graphical representation of what you see on the drive, and then there is a text representation with explanations for what all you can see on there. In the text representation part, it'll give you all sorts of information about the partition's path, the file system that it is, where it mounts to, any labels that it might have with it, the size, space used and space unused, and any kind of flags that you might include on there. Now, the key features of the drop-down menu across the top, the typical one, focusing on the view, there's a toggle switch to turn on and off device information. And that might be of interest to you or not, so you can toggle it on and off. But there's also a view that you can toggle on, a window that pops up and lets you know the pending operations. I strongly advise that to be on, so that you have a running list of all the changes that you are making, and so you can see what's going on. Because otherwise you can tell it to do a whole bunch of things, then hit the button, and maybe you won't remember that, oh, there was something in there that probably shouldn't, or I'm undoing something. So I recommend you have the pending operations visible all the time. Under the device menu, this is where we go to create the initial partition table. That's how the hard drive is going to be set up. There are a number of different ones, but I'm only going to be mentioning the MS-DOS one, or the master boot record, and the GPT, the more modern one. Under the partition drop-down menu, this is where you can get the new, create a new one, delete one, resize and move, and format it. And there's a lot of formatting options, but I'm just going to be listing right now the ones that are more relevant to what we're talking about, and that would be the ones that can be used by Linux, which is the EXT, newest, XF and BTRF, which a lot of people call ButterFS or BetterFS. And then the ones for Windows, the ones that we know about, the FAT 32 and 64, and the XFAT, the newer one, and of course NTFS. Now the thing about Linux is Linux can deal with all of those formats, but Windows does have trouble with some of those other ones. Now going back to the partition tables, the MS-DOS one is the one that goes back many, many, many years. And that's the one that was used. It creates a master boot record at the very beginning of your computer that talks about all your partitions and where they start, where they end, and such. With the MS-DOS one, there was a maximum of 4 partitions allowed on your hard drive. 3 of them or 4 of them could be primary, that would be your max, or you could have 3 primary and then make one an extended one, and that can be divided under many logical partitions, so that you could have more than 4 partitions, but they were enclosed under an extended one. Did that for a lot of years until the GPT, the GUID partition table, which is part of that good old UEFI stuff, came out. That one has, you can have a whole bunch. As you can see here, it says that in a Windows computer with 64-bit, you can have a maximum of 128 partitions, or in Linux, you can have 256. And I'd say anybody who needs that many partitions, I don't want to hear about it, because I have trouble sometimes maintaining half a dozen or so. So that's the background that way. And we're going to be able to go in and play around with it now. Oh, I'm on the wrong keyboard. No wonder the keystrokes didn't work. All right, so back to the desktop. And GParted, you'll probably find it almost on any live distro that you burn from an ISO and use, because you need to be able to maybe partition. Not all distros, once you install it on your computer, might have it. So you might have to go out and download it. But that's not a big deal. I've already got it on here. Let's get over. And I'm going to go back to it. And just to show you how things are easy, using the keyboard shortcuts, the super key, which Cal mentioned is that one with the window on it, but super key pops up your, pops up your menu, and then it always defaults to a search bar. And Cal showed that it does that on the Gnome, has a bar at the top so that you can immediately type. This is the Mate, newer Mate menu screen. The old Mate, which is the one I grew up with, which is Gnome II, had that top where it had applications, places, and systems separate. They do it this way. When you've seen the one for Cinnamon, it's more of a Windows type. I like this because it keeps things separated. So I'm just going to start typing GParted, and boo, it starts coming right up. And then with an app finder like this, you just hit enter. Now, because this is a program that will affect the whole computer, it requires sudo privileges or the password. And in the Linux world, most of the time, anything that affects just your user, doesn't require a password because you already logged in. But if you're going to do anything that would affect other users, if there were, then you have to password them in here. Wrong keyboard again. There we go. So this is GParted. As you can see, it's being used as a super user so that you can do things. Now you have to be very careful because with a program like GParted, you can do some great damage if you're not careful. But for the most part, they have some safety features in here. Right now, this is my laptop, and most of all of it is locked. It's mounted and locked, so I really can't do something to it until you unmount it. Up at the top, there's the menus we'll look at. And over at the side, I mentioned that there was the drop-down menu for all the things that are connected to your computer. Now, on my desktop, if I drop this down, there would probably be, I think there's 5 or 6, because I have operating hard drive. I've got a data hard drive. I've got miscellaneous storage. So I've got a number of different drives that are all partitioned off. Here you can see I just have 2, and that's going to be a thumb drive. And for some reason, I plugged in an external drive and it didn't show up. I'll have to try that again. All right, so drive it. Now, the thing with the KDE one, if you didn't notice it, on the left-hand side, they had the full list. So it's visible without having to do a drop-down menu. Also up in here, I can drop down and get a list through the menu system that way. So in the KDE one, it's kind of nicer because you see all the drives that you're working on right there. With the GParted, you just drop it down and get it in there. Okay, so there was the menus, and as you can see right here, there is the graphical representation of what my hard drive looks like. And you can see that I have a number of partitions, and they're all kind of color coded, and you can see that they even show you how much is used and how much is not. And on my particular laptop, I have what's called a swap file so that I have some extra memory if I need it. I also am dual booting. I'm dual booting the Linux Mint Debian edition, and I'm booting the Linux Mint Mate edition. So that's why I have those 2. I also have a home for all of my files that I store, and I have a miscellaneous folder just to put miscellaneous things in. If we go to the thumb drive, you can see that this thumb drive is just a single one. It has a FAT32, and I gave it a name. I learned that. And you can see the size and unused. And it also is mounted, so it won't let me kind of do anything to that. Let me see why that. Plug it into the actual laptop. And then all I have to do is I'll have to say refresh. No, it's still not. I was just going to show you that how to do stuff on that hard drive, but I can do the same thing on a thumb drive. When I go up to the GParted menu, if we go to view, I can get the device information. We can tell that this is a USB 3 disk, and it's partitioned in MS-DOS, and some information that doesn't make much to me. So I don't usually do the view on that one. But if I go down and tell I want to see the pending one, anything that I am telling this program to do will be listed down here. So I can review what I've done and not do something twice like I've done before. If we go to devices, this is where it talks about creating a partition table, and you can attempt to rescue data. We're not going to talk about that today, but you can create the partition table. And again, it's going to have some choices when we get to do that part. And then under the partition, here's where we can do all the different actions to our drive. One of the first things that a lot of times people do is you get a hard drive and you want to reset it up for future use, is that you want to get rid of the partition or partitions that's on there. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a right click instead of going up the menu, because we learned a long time ago, right click is your best friend, and you have that. Now the first thing, because you can see that I can't do anything in the top part, is I need to unmount this. It'll stay plugged in, but I'm going to unmount it so that I can work on it. So I'm going to unmount. And now you can see the key is gone. Now what I can do is I can right click and I'm going to say I'm going to delete this. But before I delete it, since I've got something there, I want to be able to show you about the resizing, because sometimes what you have to do for people who are wanting to do dual boot is that you might have to make room. So in a resizing, I've selected this partition I'm going to do. I can go either to the menu, I can do it with the mouse, and I hit resize. And I get two ways. I get a graphical option and I get a text option. Right now, I don't have any free space after this. And so I can put in how much I want, or I can just do the easy one. I'm going to drag, and you can see that I'm going to make a new size. It was almost 118,000 megabytes, and I'm going to shrink it down to about here and make a new one. And then I just hit the resize or move. Now the move part means that if I had, let's say, a partition and I had a lot of empty space, and for some reason I wanted to have the empty space created something new in the front, I can do this. I can just drag the whole thing and I can move it. Now, the only problem is that if there's a lot of data in here, this is going to take you, set it up and go to bed and get up in the morning, because it's going to have to move everything over. Very similar to, remember when we used to do the defragging in Windows, and you'd watch all those little color things move everything around. That's the same thing. It's got to move everything clear to the end. And it's not just like moving a box like I just did. That's just saying I want that partition moved. But if that partition's full, then the computer is going to have to move bytes by bytes by bytes and move everything down and around. So I'm not going to do that. But that's the two purposes of here. So now I could resize, and then I would have room for, another distro if I wanted to install, or I've decided I need to have an extra partition for keeping stuff. It's just kind of all up to you. So we're going to go back to this one, and I'm going to say I'm going to, or I could say I could do a reformat. Right now it's a FAT32, and if this thumb drive was only going to be used on Linux, then I could reformat it to any of the stuff that Linux does, like the ext4. That's the newest ext, so that's the one we mostly use. But you can see at the bottom, I can even make this an NTSF one or an XFS. There's a whole bunch of different uses for these, and some of them are not. The XFAT is not available. Can't reformat that to XFAT. Not quite sure why not, but I know that it's something that's very limited. If you go up to, let's see if this is the one. Nope, not that one. Oh, there we go. There's a chart here that will let you know what these different formats can do. And you can see that the exFAT is the one that you can't do much with, moving and copying. But if you look down this list, you know, you'll find out what they're good for. The ones that, like I said, the ones that we mostly do is whatever would be the Linux ones, the exFAT or the EXT, and BetterFS, and then the Windows ones if you're using it. If you're going to plan to use a partition for both Linux and Windows, then least common denominator from math class, you're going to have to do whatever it is that Windows can read, since Linux can do both. But if you try to take a drive that has been formatted for Linux, and Windows will look and say, nope, nothing there. All right, so moving on, we'll go here, and we're getting to the point where we want to start over fresh, and we're going to say we're going to delete. And now notice at the bottom, it's listing it so I know what I've set up. Nothing happens until I give the command to do it. And there's two schools of thought. One is do your partitioning work one step at a time, or you can have a list and then at the end of the list, hit the checkbox and say do it all. But you need to make sure that you are doing things in the right order and whatever. So I'm going to delete this. That's all I'm going to do. I'm say yes. Are you sure? Because we're going to lose everything. And we said, yep, that's my thumb drive. And it won't take very long. Some, you know, depending on how big it is, it might take longer. And so now as we look at it, we can see that we have an unallocated partition. It's almost the 115, which is almost my 128 thumb drive. So then we can set up. First thing we have to do is do a partition table. And so we're going to go up and create a partition table. And yeah, we know it's going to erase everything. So we could have done this as kind of a fast way. Because we know that when you erase, nothing ever gets really erased. You just leaves the partition table and says, hey, everything, this area is free. I'm going to drop the list down, and you can see here are the number of different types of partition tables that you can do. The only ones that I'm knowledgeable about, if you want to call that, is the MS-DOS and the new GPT. So those would be the two. If you wanted the MS-DOS, you know that that's going to have a 4 partition limit. If that's all you're going to need, fine. If you're going to need maybe 5 or so, you can do that with the logical ones. But if your scheme is going to be a bunch, then you probably want to do the GPT. GPT is now the one that Windows 10 is the one that they use because they need a number of partitions for the UEIF and all that stuff. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose the GPT this time, and I'm going to apply it. And this one, since it was his own menu, wasn't down listed here with the view. So I'm going to go and make sure we get the pending operations back. All right, so now it's just a matter of I can create partitions. And so I do a right click or go up to the menu. I do right click. And about the only thing that we can do, because there's nothing there, is create a new one. And then here's what you get in the choice. Where do you want to start it? I can put a bunch of blank spaces in front. What size do you want? And then whether you want space at the end. I'm just going to do it with this so we can do multiple ones. And I'm going to say, if I can do my math really clever, I'm going to do a partition that big. Now, it wants to know, is this going to be a primary partition or a logical? Well, notice that those aren't choices. I can't make a logical or an extended one because GPT, everything's a primary. I can give it a name. The next step is to go, what kind of file system are we going to use? And again, we need all that. You can see that I cannot use the exFAT one. I can read those. So we can pick any of those that we'd want to do. including the options of leaving it unformatted, the NTSF for a Windows one, and FAT32, or the Linux swap. And you can add that swap to extend your RAM. How much you do it is a game. The old days, it was kind of said you make a swap about twice as much as your RAM, back in the days when we didn't have a lot of RAM. The laptop has 8 gigs. And so I probably would make like an 8 gig swap on here. If you had a hard drive that had, 16, 32 gigs of RAM, it's hard to say, depending on what you do, whether you would actually even need a swap partition. Nowadays, too, some of the distros are setting up swap files that reside in your hard drive, and they are used as needed from the free space on there, so that a swap doesn't take up a partition. All right, so we're going to go back and just make this an ext4. I can do a label on it, and I'm just going to say add it. So you can see that it's going to create one. I have another one. I'm just going to go ahead right now and say make another new one. And I'm just going to say make it this size. It's also going to be a primary partition, also ext4. Could put a label on it. So now I'm ready. I've got 2 different choices here, or 2 settings, and I'm ready to go. So I hit the check mark and say burn it. And again, depending on how big of files and stuff you're doing, it might take a little bit longer than something, especially if you got a bigger hard drive. And of course, you've seen this before. If you hit the details, you will see what it's doing right now. It's on the first one, and then it's going to move to the second one. And you can see, for those of people who are interested in the command line, this is what it's actually doing. Here's the command that it's running. It's making a file system, the kind ext4, and it's a 64-bit, and it's going to be named device SDB1. As we've talked before, the SD is for your hard drives. A is for the first one it's connected, B, C, and D on that one. And then when you have partitions, they become, the SDAB1 and the SDBA2 and so on. This shows you how this is really the front end of the parted program, because that's what it's doing actually. We just didn't have to type all of this. We just clicked a few buttons and made it pretty easy. And so you can see now here are all the steps it's doing: creating a partition, clearing old files, setting the partition type, and then it's going to create the file. So there, it's done, and it only took a couple minutes. So I'm glad we're doing a small one. And so now it's going to start on the second one. Basically that's it. You have all these tools to create the partitions and reformat them and resize them. Now, I will mention that in the beginning years, when Cal was doing his demo, boy, it took me back to the days of Ubuntu 8.04 and around there. When we did our setup for the installations, they talked about a swap file. And almost always, back in the days, it was always you put the swap file first, and then you put everything else after it. The problem with that is that if you ever decide I need to resize that swap file, I need it bigger, you have to move everything that's on your hard drive over to make more room. And so later on, people started suggesting you know, it might be better if you put the swap at the end so that if you needed to be able to enlarge it or change it, you don't have to move everything else in the house around. So I've kind of started doing that. This laptop, I didn't do it because I knew I'd never need to make a change in the size of it. So if you know you're not going to make a change, then you can put it. But if not, ooh, a lot to move. Okay, we're almost done with that. And then we can just jump on. We'll take questions about this in just a few minutes. Okay, so I closed that, and now we have a new thumb drive. Whatever was on my thumb drive is gone. I now have 2 empty formatted partitions and a section that is unallocated that I can do something with later. You don't have to do it all at once. Okay, so now I'm going to switch back and jump on here, because in the beginning, when we first did our first install, Orv took us through an install, and we did it the most simple way. We just told the computer, take the whole hard drive and install Linux on it. But that's not what you always want to do. You might have something on there so that you need to keep your old operating system and add it to the side, or you can do what we call something else. And then something else, you go down and you say, I have these partitions, or you make them, because GParted will be on your program too. And I want to install and use these different partitions for different reasons. So I wanted to go over just really quickly a few of the partition installation schemes that we have. Oh, this finger. All right, so the normal one that we did before is what's called a basic one. It's just a single partition and everything is in that partition. Now there is that boot record that's in the very front, but the computer, when you set up everything, created that space, and then when you install, it uses that. But everything else goes on a single partition. All of your system files, all your programs, all your documents. The more common one that we, at least I do and most of us recommend, is the one with 3 partitions. And that's basically to give you the swap partition for extra RAM when you need it, and creating a separate partition for your home, for all of your personal files. And the biggest reason for that is so that if you had to reinstall your operating system, you would just reinstall everything that's on root and don't touch your home files. And that's what makes it really easy. And we've even done that, as many of us recommended to Windows users, to do the same thing. Put your files, link them over to another part so that you don't lose them. The best option is to put it on a separate hard drive, your root system on one and your home on the other. So if your root hard drive dies, you don't lose your home. If you can't, like in a laptop, separate partitions. Now, if you're going to be dual booting, then you probably would add a partition for boot so that it can make sure that it's organizing it to give you your choice of which operating system you want. And then you would have 2 different partitions for 2 different roots, or your first, and they would each include their own home. So it's just like doubling the very first one. In this one, files can't be shared between the 2 users. But if you wanted to be able to share it, then you would just have a separate home from both of the root. And then, like on my laptop, I've done that so that it doesn't matter whether I'm testing out Linux Mint Debian Edition or running my Linux Mint, I can access from either operating system all my files. And the same thing is if you're dealing with the Windows. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about this because I don't advocate dual booting with Windows. And I don't tell people about it because I don't want to have to try to support any issues that they might have. But if you're going to dual boot with Windows and Linux, you have to put Windows on first, and then you put Linux on afterwards so that the Linux grub program can make use of the Windows booting program. Now, there's also been reading that you have to maybe even have 2 boot partitions, one for boot for Windows, for Linux, and then a boot EFI for Windows. I saw somebody's configuration for a working dual boot model right now with Windows and Linux, and they have only a boot/EFI. So I'm not 100% on that because I don't do Windows dual boots, and I don't support people who do Windows dual boots. The other option is that you could create your 2 roots for your 2 operating systems, and then you create a personal file shared by both. But again, that home has to be either FAT3264 or NTSF, or Windows couldn't read those files. Now, if you want to go to the extreme, there are a few other options for creating partitions, for putting your partition called user, op for programs, temp separately. And people who do that may have reasons and can explain that. And you can even do something about var, which is variables. And you can see that this one showed me that you could create a separate partition to keep all your mail in separate from everything else. But that's an advanced person can talk about that. So we are done with that. And we'll go back to stop sharing and get back to the other computer so I have the right screens I'm clicking. And the right mouse. No thanks. Okay. So we're back and turn things over to Judy.
I have a question.
Good.
I noticed that you have your home /home directory on a separate partition. How do you tell the installation that the /home directory is on that separate partition?
That is a very good question. When we did the installation process, there are a number of questions it asks. When Orv did, they used the whole drive. It didn't ask anything else. When you use the something else, then it goes to, here are the partitions that are on this hard drive. What do you want to use? So I would mark the one I want for root and say, use this one for root, this one use for home. And then it would create it that way. Then in future, I would say, use the home, but do not reformat it. And so it would just take the root or the home that's already there and attach it to the new root.
Thank you. Other than that, I'm questionless, if that's a word. And I would like Clark Walker to please check his chat box for me and answer me. And shall we see what Orv got in the shed, so to speak?
Sure.
Ham shack.
Ham shack.
It turns out I can't show a Raspberry Pi 4. All of mine are deployed and in use, but I found a Raspberry Pi 3. This is in its enclosure. Raspberry Pi 3. Let me get the, wow, hang on. Let me see if I can get some light over here on it.
And in actuality, it's just it looks like a teeny tiny little motherboard.
Well, this is in the enclosure.
I know, but if you don't have it in an enclosure, isn't that what it looks like?
Pretty much. And this one's got a fan on the top of the enclosure.
Cool.
I'll take this out here. Hang on. Oh, the disk drive, so to speak, is this little micro SD card here. Pull it out like that. It's not marked, so I have no clue how big it is and what's on it, but that doesn't matter. Next time I use it, I'd reformat it anyway. And by the way, pay attention when you take it out. If you put it in upside down, it'll fall inside the enclosure.
Oops.
And then you have to take the enclosure out. Let's see, is this? Yeah, there we go. Oh, I was going to take it out anyway. Let me disassemble this. And, you know, it's quite, how did I get this apart? Let me think. By the way, I don't know if you can see it or not. Can you see the connector, the black connector at the bottom? It's got a bunch of pins on it.
Yeah. It would be right. There's a red one to start there. Now that's good. Or we can see that now.
Extreme close-up.
Yep.
That's called the GPIO. That's the general purpose IO. This is what makes this computer really useful for experimentation and stuff. They even give you this handy card that tells you what the pins do. Things like 5-volt power, 3-volt power. There's a serial port, a bunch of programmable pins that I don't know what all they do. The fan plugs in and it takes, I don't know, 5 or 3 volts. Very handy. This is the Raspberry Pi 3. Power supply for it. They're all 5 volts. The Raspberry Pi and the 2 and the 3 come with the old traditional USB connectors. I can't see that. The Raspberry Pi 4 comes with USB-C, so you can't use this power supply on it, which is fortunate because it doesn't have enough power. Additionally, let me see if I can find, I just threw a bunch of junk in here. Ah, here it is. There's no power switch on a Raspberry Pi 3 until Raspberry Pi 4. So if you wanted to power it down, you'd tell the OS to shut down and then unplug it, which is kind of a pain. And if you're doing it on the USB connector, it's wear and tear. But with the Raspberry Pi 4, they gave you this optional inline switch here. You can hear it. And it's got a red light. So once you tell the OS to power down, you just punch it and it shuts it off. To power it up, you just punch it again.
One of my members is going to show his Raspberry 4.
Good, good. Now or later?
After you're finished.
Okay. Because I use it out in the field for a lot of telemetry, there's a lot of things you can do with it. Let's see where it is. Oh, these aren't necessarily Raspberry Pi specific, but this is a USB temperature sensor. There's the sensor and there's the USB. Hello. Oh, there we go. And there's software so you can read the temperature in the ham radio shack up on top of the mountain and display it on a web page. Additionally, where did it go? Stand by. Ah, here we go. Again, not specifically Raspberry Pi base. This is an SDR, software-defined radio. Plug it into the USB. Put an antenna on the other end, and the software will let you listen to anything between 1 megahertz and 1.5 gigahertz. AM, FM, any kind of digital, all sorts of software will run on it, and Windows. There's the antenna for my monitor. It's a magnetic whip mount, and for the base of it is a steel cookie tin. Very handy for monitoring local police and fire, ham radio, AM, FM, and all sorts of digital stuff. back again, more specific to the Raspberry Pi, if you have a lot of temperature monitoring to do, 4 or 5 different places, these get expensive. So the Raspberry Pi GPIO has pins for what they call I to C. It's a 3-pin serial port, multiplexed. And you take this, you put it in the long cable, and you plug these into the GPIO for power, ground, and data, and you can read out the temperature from here. But the cool thing is you can hang up to 228, 255 of these on the same wire. And it just polls. Each one has a unique address. So it polls them and returns the data. Very handy. Also, if you're into building custom electronic circuits, this is a, I'll take it out. It's not put together yet. This is a breadboard for the GPIO. It'll have a space for a GPIO connector, and it comes with a bag of all sorts of connectors and ports and stuff, and you can design your own circuit, put your resistors and capacitors. By the way, boards that plug into the GPIO, and there are tons of them, A to D, D to A, AC switches, you know, too many to mount. They're called hats, hardware attached on top. And there is a booming submarket for them. So, oh, and one more thing, the Raspberry Pi 4 is more powerful, uses more power, and therefore generates more heat. So there is a huge market for aftermarket metal enclosures for it. And they use the metal as a heat sink, and they've gotten fancier and fancier. They've moved all the connectors around on one side, use little internal cables, make it much more like a real computer. And while I'm on the topic, Raspberry Pi is one of a class of computers called SBCs, single board computers. And there are a ton of them out there. Many of them are far more powerful and a little more expensive than a single board computer. And if you're thinking about using a teeny little single board computer as a main desktop, Raspberry Pi 4, in my estimation, is maybe a little underpowered. And some of these others are quite a bit better. And by the way, a lot of them are not ARM 64 like the Raspberry Pi. They're x86. So they will run Windows or, you know, anything that will run on x86 hardware. Let's see if I got anything else. Oh, and if you're really into experimenting, you bring a cable over from the Raspberry Pi 4, and this little thing is a breadboard. You can plug in and interconnect anything temporarily before you solder it together, which has nothing to do with computing, but well, actually it does. End of demonstration.
So for all intents and purposes, with your Raspberry Pi and a little of the things and a black bag, you are good to go to climb the tower and do anything that needs to be done with your ham radio stuff. And you are ready for wildfires and earthquakes and things like that.
Well, the cameras, the cameras sit on the network because they're IP cameras, but I capture a frame every 5 minutes and put it on a web page shown by a Raspberry Pi.
Okay, outstanding. And it's just a tiny dinky little thing. That's so impressive that you can do so much with something so small.
Well, remember, it's like a car. It's $35 and up. You know.
Of course. Linux is like cars also. I know John's presentation.
Well, well, some of the metal the physical add-ons add up to where frequently they're more than the Raspberry Pi. That
is true. And over to Dave Melton, and he's going to let us know what he uses his Raspberry Pi for.
Dave, go ahead and unmute yourself.
There we go. Now I finally unmuted. Good morning. So I just happen to have a Raspberry Pi 4 that I just started playing with yesterday. So it has nothing on it yet. I've tried Ubuntu, I've tried Manjaro, and several other Linux distributions. Because this is a Pi 4, which is physically the same size as Orv's Pi 3, and it has a GPIO pin. And what I'm trying to show here is it's got USB 3, a gigabit Ethernet, and USB 2, and it's got a camera connector, and it has two HDMI, micro HDMI ports, as well as the USB-C to power it. It's a fun little toy. And the one I have that I mentioned to Judy a couple weeks ago is I have a Raspberry Pi Zero. Actually, it's a 0W, which means it has wireless. So it costs a couple dollars more that I'm using as my sprinkler controller. And using some of the parts that Orv mentioned, I attached it with the wires to the GPIO pins, and with a little bit of programming and some soldering and attaching all my sprinkler valves to it, I can now run all my sprinklers. And it has a weather app that goes out and looks at yesterday's weather and adjusts my time that I run my sprinklers today. And it was mostly a fun project to do. It was not something I needed, but it was something that sounded like fun. The other thing I wanted to show is I wasn't prepared for this, so I don't have all my little box of goodies like Orv did, but I have a micro HDMI cable for the Pi, and then of course the other end for the display. Now all I need is a display that has HDMI on it to be able to use. Now, you can run a Raspberry Pi headless, which means you run it without a monitor and keyboard. That's the way I run my sprinkler timer. I just log into it with SSH, which we talked about earlier today. So I haven't even hooked the monitor up to the Pi Zero. So that's about it. That's just a toy for me at this point. Orv is obviously using it for all kinds of monitoring and that kind of stuff, and they certainly have all those capabilities. There's tons of stuff on the internet to look up, and projects and how-tos and fun things that people have done with them. So thanks, Judy.
Thank you so much, Dave. I appreciate it.
You bet.
We have Edward Kenny from, I believe, from Huntsville, and he has another thing with the Raspberry Pi, and we're going to have him do that at our next Wednesday workshop because we need to have time for Q&A now.
Cool.
So open it up, John.
It's open, so see what people have about today's presentation. I also forgot to mention at the beginning, and there's still enough people here to say a couple months ago, we asked people to put in suggestions and topic ideas into the chat box for more, because like Orv said, you know, we're getting to the spot where we've done pretty much all the general stuff, and we're not quite sure what people want. We don't want it to make it an advanced one for the new people. We don't want to make it totally new. So we need some ideas as to what else you would like to do. So here we've got one. We would like anybody who wants to get onto the Pi panel to contact Judy and say, hey, we'd like to be a part of the next month's meeting and talk Pi. So Kenny's already on for that part of it. And so if there's anybody else that, and especially like, you know, Dave, after you've had almost a month to play with yours, talk about it. We'd love to have a section of next month on Pi. So
I'll just see how cleverly we do that.
Sounds fun.
Okay, people, we need questions. Are there no questions? Was everything taught? Even our friend from Canada has not had a question, which is shocking. Absolutely shocking.
Good.
Edward's got a question. Unmute yourself.
I just want to mention, I I'm running I have VNC viewer on my Windows 10, and I can remotely control my PC on a Pi. I just want to say that's what I was talking about before.
Thank you. Over to Bill.
I just had one question, and probably you covered that. But what type of CPU does a Raspberry Pi use?
It uses an ARM CPU. I forget what it stands for, but it is not Intel compatible.
Okay, I understand. Yeah, I understand what an ARM is. That's what I was curious about.
Yeah, and only recently has the Raspberry Pi's OS moved from 32 to 64 bits. So that was a big step.
Thank you.
And Carl, you're on.
I wanted to know from Irv or from Dave if there's a Raspberry Pi app for monitoring my sump pump activity and even the maybe watts on each leg of my service entrance cable.
Orv, Melton?
Well, monitoring each leg of your service input, I assume that's 120 volts. What I have an AC power fail monitor at my sites. It's just a wall wart, a 5-volt wall wart that plugs into the AC. And if the 5 volts goes away, the Raspberry Pi detects it through the A to D converter and flags it on the web page. I don't have email alerts set. If you were going to monitor them at the input, you'd have to hardwire something in like that.
Or you could, I guess you could use an induction. I have seen it, but I have a whole house generator now, but previously I would have, you know, a separate generator. And the issue was always when the power returned, especially during daylight hours, you didn't know you didn't need the generator, you know, because I would throw the main breaker. And there was, I've seen it where there was an inductive kind of pickup and it would give you an alarm battery operated device that told you, you know, that power was back.
I think Glenn from the Durham group in Canada might have an answer because he was nodding his head. Of course, he could have been listening to somebody in the room and nodding his head to them. But hey, Glenn, do you have an answer for that question? You're gonna need to, there you go.
I think there's monitors for everything. It's just the imagination that gets it going.
You're gonna have to yell at us because we can barely hear you.
Okay, I haven't got the mic set up high enough, probably. Mic should be a little better now. There's monitors for everything. You can monitor everything, and there's no difference between putting it on a Raspberry Pi or putting it on a IBM type computer or on a control network. It's just how you hook it up. So go for it, hook it up. And to Orv there, nice to hear the presentation, BE3LIZ.
Thank you, 73.
And Carl is going to do something, and then one of these Linux workshops, he's going to tell us how whatever he did works.
That'd be good.
So, yeah, I hope to be able to do that. Thanks for all your help and excellent presentations today. It was well worth the time, especially the Linux background. And I've used Linux years ago, but I just love being up to date on what's going on. And it's the presentations make the difference. And Cal did an awesome job.
And if John has his way, you will join the crowd, comma, or else. Murray, you're on.
You have to unmute, Murray.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I just want to say good morning to everybody and thank you for the great presentations. And I have a Raspberry Pi 4 and as a desktop, that's not what I tend to use it for, but it works very beautifully. I have a monitor and Bluetooth keyboard and mouse, and I've also tried it with a webcam, and all that works wonderfully.
Good. Thank you for that. I hope that Mike was wondering, what to use a Pi for. So I hope that this gives you an idea that actually I'm not into the upper end, but I have taken a Pi and hooked it up and used it as a computer, and got on the web, got my email, this and that. So it's just a miniature sized motherboard that has to connect up. But what we didn't also mention is that the newest Pi out there is embedded in a keyboard. And so now you have a keyboard with the Pi inside of it and plugs on the back of the keyboard to connect to your monitor. And you almost have, it's almost like an all-in-one except for the monitor. Oh, and Mike's question, it runs Linux, of course. It's based Linux running. It has some special distros created special for it, and the ARM processor. And yes, or which one are you running on yours?
On which? I'm sorry.
On your Pi. What OS?
I think they're calling it Raspi OS. Well, it's a mix. The older ones are Raspi and the newer ones are Raspi OS, and it's looking more and more like Debian all the time. Mm-hmm. Oh, by the way, you posted in the chat room, but maybe people weren't looking. I posted the link, and thank you for copying it, for Raspi Sump.
And that will come out in the follow-up material. And okay. Melton, what OS are you using? I'll just throw the question to him too, so I can get 3 different answers.
Well, I'm using Raspi OS, or whatever it's called today, on my Pi Zero. And since I just started with the Pi 4, I'm not using anything yet. I'm probably going to end up using Raspbian on that as well.
Okay.
Well, I hope a number of you, when Judy sends out a little notice saying we'd like to have a portion of our next month's workshop on Pi, that you will take part, because I can't. I'll just host.
Right, because the guy who gave, his name is Chuck LaForce, who gave the presentation to us, oh Lord, it had to be well over 10 years ago. His funeral is Sunday. He's well into his 90s. So this is kind of for him, because he started me off thinking it was absolutely amazing what you could do with it. Can somebody tell us why we have the Pi? And why it's so small and why it's so inexpensive?
Well, that's the main reason. It's because it's inexpensive. It was originally brought out and still is in Britain, and it's meant for an educational device. You can buy lots of them for very little money.
Wasn't it designed for the folks in Africa first?
Yes, I think that's true.
Oh shoot, Glenn says no. Is that an old wives' tale?
Well, maybe it is.
It's meant for an education purpose.
Okay.
Well, Africans need education also.
Yeah. I'm looking that up. Kurt, your question. You took your hand down.
I was just going to comment on the Pi. My understanding is that it was for educational purposes, but I'll make another comment with it. I run a couple of them. One of them is running a Pi hole, which cuts down on advertisements on many websites and things like that. But it's possible to take a Pi out of the box and hook it up and never put a keyboard or a network cable on it. With a couple of tricks using a supplicant file, and you can run them completely headless. Connect, use your Windows machine or whatever else you want to connect to them, and use VNC to see them and control them. Also, one of the things that I like about a Pi, and this holds to everything except the Pi 4, is that they don't take expensive hardware or power supplies. and every one of my Pis except the Pi 4 have run on either a 1 or 2 amp cell phone charger. And we've all got lots of those sitting around.
Boy, I hear more and more topics and items for next month.
It was developed in 2013 and it sold for $35 and it was the size of a credit card.
Yeah, you heard about when it went to market, they opened the website. They were expecting maybe to sell 10,000 eventually. After the website got done crashing, they had 100,000 orders.
Yeah.
And it's really taken off. It's quite a sub-industry by itself, and it's invigorated the small board computer industry.
Okay, well, don't forget to send me, you know, an email letting me know that you would like to say a few words about what you're doing with your Raspberry Pi at our next
demoing.
Oh my gosh, Linux 11 meeting.
Yep.
And I'm expecting one from Gwen. He's the new kid on the block here, so to speak.
That'd be great.
We people from SoCal are pushy, okay? Any other questions? Nope. Orv says the best source for Pi hardware is Amazon. Of course.
It can be, but a lot of the hats are sold separately, or you can get a better buy through them. Just Google what you're looking for and go from there.
Every time you talk about hats, I mentally put a hat on. But
I know. Hardware attached on top.
That.
If you have, let me interject. If you have a Micro Center around, their prices are better than Amazon, and you can walk out and pick it up, bring it home with you that day.
I don't know if ours in Orange County is still around, but Fry's was our main thing here in California, and they've.
Our Micro Center is still around, Judy.
What?
Our Micro Center is still around. That's where my Pi 4 came from.
Very good. Did you order? Did you drive all the way down there with no traffic?
Actually, my son drove down there.
As well he should. That's what we have children for.
That's right.
Anyway, don't forget next Wednesday, we are doing Dale Harrington from Micro PC in Denver is going to talk about email 101. Is email still going to be viable? And John is doing, and give the title of your presentation.
Communication, security, and privacy with the Proton Technologies family.
And his favorite website, and I did forward the article to you, John, DuckDuckGo just came out with a similar type email program. So there.
So yeah, we'll do Proton Mail and Proton VPN.
No more questions? Don't forget, we need ideas for workshops. Bob G has a question.
That new item from DuckDuckGo is only on your iPhone and your Android phone.
Oh,
there isn't, yeah, right now. And I really don't do much on my cell phone. I may look at things, but I don't interact with it. So
thank you.
Until they have a desktop, I'll have to wait to try it.
That is too cool that that's all you use your phone for, because that's what I do, and everybody makes fun of me.
That's okay.
So if don't make fun of Bob.
We're in the same place.
Yeah, because you're doing it when you make fun of me. Anyway, thank you for attending. I really appreciate you guys all being here and sharing. It's really great. And you will get the answers to the very few questions that we had in the chat box, as well as PDFs of the presentations and the link to the video.
And even though this is
see you next week.
Yep, the Linux group, we're still looking for ideas for other future Wednesday workshops, because there's 4 Wednesdays in a month.
I have an idea. We could have the people who have Linux SIGs tell us what they are doing in their Linux SIGs, So, and say, hey, if you want to go to this, oh, Ungerman, put your hand down. If you wanted to attend the brand new Central Florida Computer Society Linux SIG, Mike would say, hey, come on down, and no matter where you live, we're on via Zoom, and join us, or the Columbus Computer Society, or John's. The Olympia group in Washington, state of Washington, has a Linux SIG. And with our group sharing meetings, those people, groups that are sharing their meetings, they'd like that you can go to their SIGs too. And the Cal with a K from Canada is nodding his head. So he could, again, somebody could be talking to him from in the room, but so why don't we have everybody give a little shout out about what you are doing to share ideas, and oh, we'll do that next time maybe, or we'll put it on our list of things to do.
Yeah, I also put a plug in for the Chicago Computer Society. They are starting up a Linux group, and I think their first meeting is coming up soon, and they're trying to get started. So I'm really excited about the fact that we've had a couple of groups start up, maybe because of our Linux workshops. So that's great.